Thank you so much, and I'm delighted to be joining you from Oxford, England. It's a place that's full of ideas, just like this incredible gathering of people that are thinking today about human security, and more importantly, what do we do next, individually and collectively and through all of our networks. I loved what was just mentioned about the all-encompassing nature of human security, about the urgency of human security, and in one sense, the infinite measure of human security. We will never be finished with this task, but we must start now and continue the amazing work that we've already seen happening through the UN security effort, post-Cold War especially, UNDP, the Human Development Report in 1994, I think it was, to shift the focus from a military and defense context really to one in investment in humanity and nutrition and health and social and economic inclusion on a grand scale. So it was in 1999 when this trust fund was established to promote human security and to really activate projects. And now again, a new report, UNDP last year, human security threats in the Anthropocene. In other words, the world that is dominated by human life and the ramifications that it holds. So I'm delighted now to introduce our next panelist, who is Ketan Patel, with a rich background in business and finance.
Thank you very much, Isabella. Thank you, Liberato, for inviting me to this very important gathering. And thank you again on behalf of my colleagues from the World Academy of Art and Science and the Human Security for All campaign for this important collaboration with you. This is a subject that we have studied as part of something that I chair called Force for Good. Force for Good looks at the capital in the world and the system of capital and how it moves around the world to identify whether it will actually fund the UN Sustainable Development Goals and deliver the human security that we all think should be here for all of us. I step back first and say that since 2015 and the launch of the SDGs, the last 7 years have shown our ability to do extraordinary things to address these big issues. Trillions of dollars have been committed by banks and institutions for climate change. The medical development during the pandemic, the high inclusion and huge inclusion programs that have been launched all across the world to include minorities, and financial inclusion systems that have been launched that have brought about 500 million people into the banking and payment system. These challenges that we've been facing have brought out the best in us, but also unfortunately brought out the worst in us. And so what we find is all the good things that we might describe really only serve somewhere between a third and half of the world's population. And as that population grows, of course, the system strains to see if it can deliver to the remainder. But we should not be mistaken. The current system, the current model of finance and of economics are designed to only serve approximately a third and maybe half of the world. They're not fit to serve the rest. And if we look at it this way and say almost everything we consume, everything we touch and feel is born of fossil fuels and the fossil fuel era and the industrialization that followed that. So the whole system is built on an energy source which gave huge prosperity and created all the interlinkages we see now between the world in terms of trade and the economics that we see that flows through the financial system and puts man on the moon and so on. But it is not designed to serve everybody. It has not reached most of the global south. And so it's not a system that can actually survive if we wish to have human security for all. This system, though, under strain as it was, has been shaken in the last 6 to 7 years or so by populism, by the pandemic, and by power rivalry. And so it is unraveling. And the latest UN assessment shows that none of the 17 goals are on track to be achieved by 2030. In fact, 12% of the underlying targets are on track, just 12%. 50% are moderately or severely off track, and nearly 40% have either stalled or regressed below the 2015 levels. That's the scorecard. If we simply step back and say, what did we do? We did some fantastic things. And that list of innovations, which we publish every week on the Force for Good website and to a very large group now across the world, is extraordinary in terms of achievements. But the scorecard is very simple. We are serving, in terms of the SDG goals and achieving those, only 12% of those goals are being delivered. In the last year, it's estimated that maybe record amounts were invested in the UN SDGs, but progress stalled. And so the funding requirement to 2030 did not decline. The estimate is probably a few $1 trillion have been invested once again, and higher than before, and yet we still step backwards. We do a very detailed analysis, and we're about to release next week our report on capital as a force for good, which actually looks at how the money flows through the world, where it ends up, and what it's spent on. It also looks at this year the solutions. And what we find is without innovation, some radical innovation, based on our estimates, the total funding to achieve the SDGs, without this radical mobilization of solutions and initiatives, would take up approximately 1/3 to 40% of the world's money. Clearly, that money will not be made available because 1/3 to 40% of the world's money is not waiting to be handed off to something else. It's already utilized paying salaries, building infrastructure, paying pensions, paying insurance, and so on and so on and so on. It is not there to be mobilized for anything else. So how do we solve those problems? It seems like an intractable problem, despite us being such a smart species with so much depth and such ability to innovate. We seem to fail at this task. Our work, which we'll be launching, as I say, sometime next week, looks at how you close that gap. And what we find is there are a number of solution areas, and it's exciting to actually find that actually that gap can be closed, and potentially in the timescale, but it will require an immense task of mobilization. We identify 6 solution areas, which I won't go through to take away from the report that I know our people would like to put into the marketplace next week. But it points to a series of solutions, 6 types, which if mobilized and put into the market and rolled out across the world, would actually close the gap. In fact, what is exciting is they would close more than 100% of the gap. So it's not as if we have a lack of solutions, a lack of answers to this problem. We go a step further in the report. We look at it and say, can we be very specific? For example, policy is a big area which can solve the problems. Can we identify which policies should be rolled out? And so we look across the world at the policies and who has the best frameworks of policies and how those might be rolled out across the world. And we find that, yes, policies can solve nearly 1/3 of the world's problems, and they exist somewhere in the world in a form which is very advanced and very sophisticated and can tackle the issues. So there is good reason to be hopeful that actually we can do that. For some reason, the implementation of this is very difficult. So we have gone a step further. We've said, just like the policy one, can we identify other solutions? And we will report on 15 such initiatives, which are of different levels of scale and implementation, but are scalable and transferable globally. And these 15 are indicative of what could be done to close nearly 100% of the gap. I wish to step back, and I intended to keep this short and to the point. And I would say that NGOs feature in our list of 15 great things that could be done. And Liberato, you and I have spoken often and touched on how Force for Good should work with Congo. And we very much would like to, because what we find is there are NGOs that are exemplary in terms of their scale, their capacity to fund, their ability to make an impact, to measure, to report back. And so NGOs have a critical role to play as part of the solution set that can close this gap. They're usually deeply underfunded. There are a few that are not, but mostly they are. At their best, what we find is they have, number one, a deep knowledge of the challenge. Number two, they understand which solutions work today. And number three, they have judgment on what might work in the future. And they are filled with great people who are very, very dedicated to the challenge at hand. And in that sense, they want to solve the issue. And at their best, they epitomize humanity serving humanity. In the Indian language, this is called seva. And this service of others is an important ingredient in the success of the most successful of the NGOs. The IPCC report points to 5 scenarios that are part of the underpinning of all their climate reports. These 5 are very important. They paint a picture of the potential future of humanity and how we might transition. Not after that, but how we might transition. These 5 scenarios include, number 1, a green path, where we agree all together to retrench back, to reduce our economic footprint. It seems very unlikely this will happen. Our system is not organized politically or economically for leaders to go to their people and say, I want you to retrench 30% of your economic footprint so that we can save the planet. People just don't seem ready to do it. Even 15 million people dying during the pandemic doesn't make people ready today to actually retrench. Another scenario is playing out the current trend line, which is mediocre and will not achieve the SDGs, will not level up the world. The third is nationalism and security rivalry, which is what we seem suited to. We seem to want to fight each other and find reasons to find fault with each other and follow that through. The fourth is a disunited and unequal progress. We also seem suited to that. Those that have it seem to want to keep it, even during the pandemic. Those that were overstocked with vaccines kept them rather than share them, very often. And then it took the UN and others to figure out programs for this distribution. The final is a risky gamble to go all out for growth using fossil fuels in the hope that just in time, innovation will bail us out and we will find a timely solution. It's a risky gamble. So there is no ideal scenario. There isn't a conversation around these 5 to figure out where we should land. And so just as I wrap up, I would say, one thing is clear as we look at the complexity of the systems that allow economics and trade and finance to flow across the world, that individuals have a critical role to play, not because they should solve the problems necessarily, but because they do have a critical role to play, because they own 2/3 of the world's money. And if we can hope that with rising consciousness comes a more conscious form of capitalism, the individual will probably be the most important player in this system. As individuals are leaders, just like all the people on this call. Individual are followers, like many of us on this call. But individual also take all these positions as CEOs and heads and so on. And individuals, more importantly, are consumers. And as such, something like 2/3 of the world's consumption are choices made by individuals. And those choices will change because the internet is interconnecting all of us. And so we're at a unique point in human history where we get connected to each other in real time completely. It's never happened before. To send messages took so long. It took travel. And then there were phone lines that were unreliable. But now, if everyone is connected, it's a unique point where we have a choice and a chance to maybe raise all of human consciousness and awareness so that people are more aware of the consequences of their actions. And we all take different decisions. AI will not only spur that, it will make it an imperative because another potential intelligence is being born that may be more clinically tougher than us, that may be different, that may make different choices. And so we have to raise our consciousness. The conditions under which other stakeholders, not just the individual, but the private sector and the public sector, will make choices about their role and how they can make an impact are explored in our report. And it's positive, as I say, we're pleased to report that we are very positive as a result of this very detailed work, that it is in our grasp to create a more peaceful, prosperous, and freer world where human security for all is the cornerstone, the touchstone of how we move forward. Thank you very much for an opportunity to say that to all of us. Thank you.
Ketan, thank you so much for those words, putting it in the context of the systemic risks, the geopolitical risks, a need for priorities, and I especially appreciated the idea of solutions. I remember reading your previous report, and it really was breathtaking. There's a line, certainly in American English, follow the money. And I think that's what you've tried to do, follow the money to see how that money can be directed toward the SDGs and toward human security. So I look forward to reading the report, and I would recommend it to everyone. You also mentioned a sense of conscientiousness, but I also thought of conscience when I think about Congo, and I've been familiar with their work for many years over a number of campaigns going back decades. And that is what struck me. They are indefatigable, they are creative, they are connectors, and they are so passionate. But in a sense, I remember thinking one night that they're the conscience of the world.